But now we are ready and all set. So my name is Lilian, and I'm from the World Evangelical Alliance Sustainability Center here in Bonn. I'm sitting here together with my colleague Matthias Brüning, the director.
Hello.
And it's my pleasure to moderate you through this webinar today. We have a great topic, which is on the occasion of the season of creation, how churches can really engage in creation care. And I'm especially honored that we can host this webinar together with the World Council of Churches and Bread for the World. And we also have speakers, which I will introduce shortly from these two organizations. Before we get started in terms of topics, I would like to just quickly raise your attention to the technical modalities of this software. So on the top left of your screen, you should see like these small green buttons that look like a camera, like a microphone, and like a speaker. So they have to be green for your webinar software to work. And if you cannot hear anything, you should click on the meeting button and then click on audio setup wizard and go through the steps that the software guides you through. And then you should be able to connect your audio with the webinar software and you should be able to hear. Right. So let's get into our agenda of today's webinar. As I said already, the topic is on the season of creation, how churches can really engage in creation care. And I suppose many of you know the season of creation, but I will once again explain a little bit the background to this season. It's an annual celebration of prayer and action to protect creation, and it's an ecumenical celebration celebrated by 2.2 billion of Christians of all traditions. And the leaders of various faith traditions have encouraged the faithful to participate, and you can see their statements on the website of the season of creation. And this global celebration began in 1989 with the ecumenical patriarch of the Orthodox Church, who recognized the 1st of September as the day of prayer for creation. And it runs from the 1st of September until October 4th, which is the feast of St. Francis, who is the patron saint of ecology in many Christian traditions. And so this year, the World Evangelical Alliance Sustainability Center, together with the World Council of Churches and Bread for the World, decided to host a little webinar on the occasion of the season of creation. And we want to look at how churches can really engage in creation care. And we want to look at this from different perspectives. And this is also the perspectives that our speakers represent. So we will get started with a theological background to creation care, which will be introduced to us by Dietrich Werner, who is advisor for theological questions and an expert in eco-theology from Bread for the World. And then we will look at the level of churches, where Athena from the World Council of Churches will present a road map for congregations, communities, and churches for an economy of life and ecological justice. And then we have Cheryl with us from MICA, and she will look at the global level, how global multi-stakeholder Christian networks can advocate for creation care. And we will continue on the global level with Ben from Tierfund, who is the coordinator of Renew Our World, and Matthias, who is the director of the World Evangelical Alliance Sustainability Center. And then, after having looked at these perspectives, we want to see and hear from Ed Brown from the Lausanne WEA Creation Care Network, some individual steps, like what can we on an individual level do in order to take care of creation. And then at the end, there is the opportunity to ask questions. And if you have questions throughout the presentations, I would like to ask you to write them in the chat. And then we will gather the questions at the end, because in between we don't have the opportunity to ask questions, so it's better to write them in the chat. Then I would like to tell you that we will record this. We are recording this webinar, and we will also share it online on our YouTube channel. So if you don't want to be on the webinar, you should just not use your microphone or just use the chat. And I will be very strict with time. This is an announcement for our speakers so that we can finish on time. So now I am delighted to introduce our first speaker, Dietrich Werner from Bread for the World. And you should be able to see your slides in just about a second. And then I will click through your slides for you, if that's okay.
That's fine. Can you hear me,
yeah.
Lillian?
Okay, great. Yes, we
can hear that's you. Great. So
and
I can start.
If you want, you can
Thank you.
Start sharing your webcam. Okay.
Thank you so much. So my name is Dietrich Werner. I'm just a normal ordained pastor from Lutheran church tradition. I have worked for many years also in theological education and in World Council, and currently serve in Bread for the World, which is a major Protestant development agency located in Berlin in Germany. And just 6 major points I would contribute to this webinar. The Seasons of Creation is a unique opportunity to learn amongst the churches on creation theology and particularly on eco-theology. And I make a distinction between the two, because we can argue that we are looking back to 2,000 years of creation theology, because all of Christian tradition and New Testament and Old Testament traditions confirm the faith in God, the Creator, the sustainer of the whole world. You read the wonderful Psalm 104, and you cannot but be astonished about this unique affirmation of God being the creator of all humankind, all animals, plants, and the whole of the inhabited earth. Eco-theology, which is in a more precise sense the interdisciplinary attempt to relate Christian theology to modern insights of natural science and the conditions in which humankind have changed the fate of this earth, is much shorter a period. I would argue that the attempts of moving towards eco-theology were born in the ecumenical movement around late 50s and early 60s, particularly due to the World Assembly of World Council of Churches in New Delhi, 1961. This is when many of the Orthodox churches joined the ecumenical movement, and also the International Missionary Council, which brought in Christianity from the global south, was structurally united with World Council of Churches. This was a major attempt also to learn from Orthodox theology, which had Trinitarian thinking very much in its focus. I think the emergence of eco-theology in the period after 1961 is due to the influence of Orthodoxy and its cosmocentric ecclesiology, or its understanding of the work of the Holy Spirit. It is also due to the beginning dialogue between faith and natural science, and also the new insights of modern biblical scholarship explaining about the different narratives of creation embedded in the biblical tradition. A critical role after the publication of the Limits to Growth report of the Club of Rome in 1973-74 was played by the Bucharest Conference of the World Council of Churches on the role of science, technology, and human development, because this actually is the birthplace of the ecumenical concept of sustainability, which was developed almost 20 years before the UN Rio Conference on Sustainability and Development in 1992. It is very interesting that this ecumenic concept of sustainability was bringing biblical insights and also defining an understanding of development which is close to the biblical concept of shalom, of peace, and peace for all. So there is an interrelation between the relations between human beings and the nations, and the relation between humankind and nature, and the relation between humankind and God. Sustainable development was defined as a concept of development in which environmental pollution is kept well under the capacities of the ecosystem to absorb pollution, in which utilization of non-renewable energy resources is lower than what can be made available as new resources, and human activities are to be held within the boundaries of natural climate conditions. This was quite revolutionary in a period of 74, although it has become common sense now in UN negotiations and discourses which have taken up the term sustainability in later stages. In the year 2013-14, we did a major report in WCC, which I have here. I don't know whether you can see this on the screen. It is a global ETCF report made available by the Program on Ecumenical Theological Education, a report on eco-theology, climate justice, and food security in theological education. And I refer this to you and to those listening to this webinar because many of you might be also students of theology or students of other disciplines in Christian theological colleges. 2/3 of those who responded to this global survey have argued that their regional context is already heavily affected by the effects of climate change, though only 1/3 of the theological schools say that they have had experience with interdisciplinary courses on eco-theology. And 65 of the respondents have argued that they would definitely need more resources, and there is an immense need for strengthening eco-theological concerns and learnings in theological education. So my hope also for this conversation and this webinar is that we are forging new strategic links between institutions of theological education, faith renewal movements, and civil society networks like climate justice networks, European Christian Environmental Network, Evangelical Environmental Network, Ecumenical Water Network, and Globe Ethics, and also ACT Alliance, because we need these strategic alliances between theological formation and education and the eco-theological awareness creation movements which is going on. One important part of this, and I move to the third slide, is the Vollis Manifesto for an Ecological Reformation of World Christianity. It is not out of the blue that it was in an Orthodox environment that this manifesto was developed in an international theological consultation. Classical European Reformation 500 years ago had focused on Christology as the relationship between man, women, and God, and the understanding of salvation and grace was at stake. But 500 years later, this Vollis Manifesto has argued a more comprehensive theological approach is needed as the relationship between God and the whole of creation is at stake, and humankind and its behavior has altered and challenged the sensitive balances within creation. That is well reflected within the theoretical paradigm of the Anthropocene, which theologists have come up with. Therefore, the Vollis Call, which was developed together by Reformed theologians, Lutheran, Orthodox, Anglican theologians, many of them participated, has argued that we need an ecological reformation of the whole of Christianity to develop a Trinitarian perspective of eco-theology and to go beyond what Pope Francis in Laudato Si calls an anthropocentric despotism. It's a very interesting document, the Vollis Manifesto on an Ecological Reformation, which identifies ecological learning as a common concern of all streams within world Christianity. And therefore, I'm very happy that you took this initiative, which is close to the Vollis Call. There is another conference, and I point to number 4 in the slides, which is the Wuppertal Call, which is the result of an international conference of ecumenical Christian partners of Bread for the World, EKD, United Evangelical Mission, and the EMW organization in Hamburg, to bring together ecological learning journeys of different streams of Christianity. Also, this document, Kairos for Creation, the Wuppertal Call, you can find on WCC website. And if you Google, you find both the Vollis Call and the Wuppertal Call on WCC websites. There was a strong sense of the 60 participants of the Wuppertal International Conference on Ecology and Ethics of Sustainability that there is a new sense of urgency of the ecological crisis, bearing in mind not only the melting of ice glaciers, but also the erosion of fertile soils, the desertification of many parts of fertile countries in the global south. And there was an immense feeling that we need to increase listening and the feeling with suffering creation. So Christianity is a steward, has a pastoral, even a priestly role with regard to suffering of creation, which is referred to in the letter of Romans in chapter 8, verse 22. And we are, as Christians, not just standing apart from this, but we have our own involvement in the root causes of the crisis. There are people even going like Lynn White and others accusing Christianity to be the main cause of environmental destruction. But I would not go as far as this because this is overdone. But we can say that it is Christian nations in the world which do not yet give the God is still present with his promise to renew the face of the earth. That is spelled out in Psalm 104, verse 30. And there is an interesting image which also comes from biblical tradition that there shall be a year of complete rest for the land, which is Leviticus 25, verse 5. And this, according to the participants of Wuppertal consultation, calls for a declaration of a decade for the healing of creation. So a 10 years period to be started during the next assembly of WCC in 2021 in Karlsruhe. That is a call we have communicated to WCC to consider this as a serious invitation to call for a global decade for the healing of creation as a continuation of the conciliar process of justice, peace, integrity of creation, to intensify learning between the different Christian traditions in the area of ecology and ethics of sustainability. I now come to almost my last point, which is the next slide, that refers to our church in Germany, the Evangelische Kirche in Deutschland, the Protestant churches in Germany. I show you this little publication, which has 150 papers. And it is very interesting that EKD circles and a specialized commission, which has worked for 2 years, has come up with a major new study on animal ethics, food ethics, and sustainability ethics in September, just the other week. So you find this study, which in German language is available under the title Nutztier- und Mitgeschöpf, Tierwohl, Ernährungsethik und Nachhaltigkeit aus evangelischer Sicht. You can find this already in the internet, and it will be available fully translated into English in December this year. Now, I cannot summarize this very easily, but just to give you 4 highlights. We need to reread key biblical texts on the relation between humankind, animals, and God. Read something like Kohelet chapter 3, verse 19, or the very interesting fact that animals are an integral part of the commandment to have the period of Sabbath as a rest. That also is, yes, I will come to the end.
Okay, great, thank you.
So just to finalize with one last sentence, we can skip the rest. It is a very important reminder which has been published here that animals are co-creator of humankind, and they are also gifted with the Spirit of God, and we need to treat them differently. And this comes to the conclusion that the system of industrialized agriculture needs to be reformed in terms of more animal welfare and sustainability criteria, and our rates of meat consumption currently in Western countries like Western Europe and particularly the US are not sustainable at all and ethically responsible for Christian perspectives. This is a very interesting study, and I skip the rest and wish you all the best for the continuation of this wonderful webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dietrich, for your input. This was very, very informative and relevant. I will just hand over the floor to Athena now, from the World Council of Churches. Athena, I wanted to make you presenter, but I cannot do it for the way you logged in, but I will enable your microphone and then we should be able to hear you. Athena? Can't hear you. You have to unmute your microphone on the top of the presentation where there's like a small microphone button with an arrow on the right side. Okay, right, Athena. If you can, because it says you are registered as with an HTML client, so I think that might be the problem. So if you have that possibility to, now it worked. Right. If you enable your microphone now, we should be able to hear you. And to start your webcam. Right, Athena, I will give you some time, okay, to solve this out. And Cheryl, if you, yeah, Athena is having difficulties, yes. Maybe we will move on to Cheryl, if you can, Cheryl, then we will just switch the presentation. And Cheryl, if you can unmute yourself.
Yes, then now I can hear. Although I still don't understand what is wrong.
Oh, now we can hear you, Athena.
I can come after this one.
No, Athena, if you can, then it would be better if you could start. Right. Yeah.
So, friends, sorry for that technical. My name is Athena.
Can you also share your video, Athena?
Video. Start my webcam. Is that the correct one?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So again, good afternoon. My name is Athena Peralta, and I work with the World Council of Churches as Program Executive for Economic and Ecological Justice. I would also, at this point, also like to thank the organizers of this webinar, but also I want to thank Dietrich for also sharing the historical engagement of the World Council of Churches in ecotheology, which makes my task much more easier. This afternoon, it is my pleasure to present the roadmap for congregations, communities, and churches for an economy of life and ecological justice. As some of you may know, a colleague and dear friend who passed away in the Ethiopian Airlines crash on his way to the UN Environment Assembly, his name was Reverend Norman Tendis, was central in developing this roadmap together with me and with others in the economic and ecological justice team at the WCC. As you may note from the title, the roadmap brings together economic and ecological justice, understanding that the two are inextricably intertwined. And I think this emerges also from several assemblies of the World Council of Churches, including the one in New Delhi in 1965. Now, the roadmap is a practical tool The World Council of Churches has, of course, been engaged for several decades, as Dietrich has also pointed out, on theological reflection, as well as advocacy for economic and ecological justice, including, for instance, at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Conference of Parties. But this roadmap is particularly aimed at helping churches and church-related institutions to walk the talk. So it's an invitation to congregations, communities, and faith-based institutions to discuss a 5-step, or not necessarily a step, but a 5-part program to change the way we deal with the economy and with our ecological surroundings. So if we go on to the next slide, the first part of the roadmap has to do with living in accordance with the covenant with God and creation. As a faith community, we can support and practice small-scale, life-giving agriculture as an alternative to conventional industrial agriculture that, as we all know, is poisoning our food, poisoning our waters and our soils. And one concrete way to do this is to create community gardens in church-owned lands where organic, pesticide-free vegetables and fruits, medicinal herbs, plants and trees that are on the biodiversity endangered list may be cultivated. By bringing consumers and producers together, these gardens also help to deepen relationships within the community, as well as also provide opportunities for productive work for those that need it. So if you look at the photo that is shown in the slide in particular, this is a photo of the Rainbow Garden that Reverend Tendis helped to establish in his parish in a village in Austria. And this Rainbow Garden provided migrants and refugees who were waiting for their permits to be processed an opportunity to work with the land, earn a bit of income, but also had the value added of helping them heal from past trauma, and also helping migrants and refugees to plant their roots, so to speak, in a new community. So aside from community gardens, we as churches can also promote blue communities by saying no to bottled water and providing clean drinking water in our buildings and during our events. And I'm sure my colleague Dinesh Suna will have more to say on this if you have questions. But the WCC became a blue community a few years ago. So we turn to the next slide. The second part of the roadmap has to do with renewable energy and climate protection. So to begin with, we should start monitoring, first of all, our energy consumption, and of course, with a view to controlling our energy use as churches or faith-based institutions. And in particular, those of us who are based in more privileged spaces have the responsibility to improve the energy efficiency of our buildings, for instance, such as by switching to eco-electricity where and when it's available, but through other means as well, such as through installing solar panels and so forth. Also in this section, we have to promote climate-friendly mobility. And again, there are many ways of doing this, starting from the most simple. We could post timetables for public buses. That's like the most easiest thing that we can do. But we could go further. We could offer subsidies for the use of public transport, organize carpooling systems within our offices and churches, organize carbon offsetting for our work-related travels and meetings, for instance. This part also has to do with dealing with materials more consciously. And so concrete ways of doing this include printing on recycled papers in our institution, avoiding styrofoam and plastic in our cafeterias and meetings, and that could be a start. So if we could move on to the next slide, which is looking at just and sustainable consumption. I mean, obviously, churches and church-related institutions are also consumers. And so in our offices, we should, as a principle, purchase durable products that adhere to social and ecological standards as well. In our cafeterias, we should officially introduce and apply the best offer principle. That is, for instance, offering food that is nutritious but also fair traded. So fair traded coffee, tea, chocolate, and so forth. And again, this is about reducing waste, for instance, by cutting down on our paper consumption through organizing paper-free meetings where documents can be accessed online or digitally. And if and when we use paper and other materials, we have to also put in place a system of recycling if there isn't one already. The fourth part, and so we move on to the next slide, is on building economies of life. And I think this is really important, that our churches and institutions should create, should protect, and should multiply spaces for moneyless interaction. Spaces where our churches can offer a rest or a break from daily life and culture, which are so obsessed with money and how to make more of it. So we can do this also by beginning to practice alternative economic models that are not based on the market or are not money-oriented. And again, the starting point could be something very easy and basic, such as organizing a shelf where anyone can drop items he or she no longer needs, and where others could take these items for free. And in fact, we have such a shelf for books right on the floor in my office. But we could also take it, in fact, we should take it also to another level. For instance, by establishing a secondhand shop, food sharing points, repair cafes, skills exchange networks. And I think it would be good to highlight an example here, an example from the St. John's Church in Hong Kong, where members of the congregation kind of list what kind of skills they can offer to other members of the congregation, and then have some form of exchange. As it happens, this church in Hong Kong has a lot of migrant workers, who do domestic work, for instance. And so what happens here is that you have members of the congregation who are domestic workers. They exchange 1 hour of their cleaning time, for instance, with someone else in the congregation, for instance, a doctor. So 1 hour with a doctor equals 1 hour of cleaning time. So that's just one example of how it's being practiced. Our churches and institutions are also investors. And so key here is also practicing just finance, including divesting from fossil fuels, as quite a few churches have already done, but also divesting from other socially destructive or ecologically destructive activities. But not just stopping at divestment, but also investing as well in socially uplifting and ecologically nurturing activities And again, we can also take it to another level by establishing church-owned ethical banks specifically for this purpose. And the final and last part of the roadmap is focused on networking. And I think it starts with identifying who the contact persons are within our churches and institutions so that we can begin to be in touch and to begin to exchange ideas. We know that while many of these actions that we have shared, and as well as other lifestyle changes are important, we know these are important, but they are not enough. And so we have to begin to raise our voices on issues of economic and ecological justice in our communities, nationally, regionally, and globally. And we know that we have more credibility in our advocacy if we are also practicing what we preach. The last point is really about actively building alliances with other like-minded institutions and networks, with other faith groups, with other social movements and civil society actors, so that we can learn from them, so that we can share with them, and so that we can accompany them, and so that we can also be accompanied. Because in the end, the challenges of transitioning to a zero carbon and redistributive economy are tremendous. And we know that this needs nothing less than a global movement dedicated to transformation. And so I'm closing here. I want to thank everyone, and I hope that we can do our part. So the roadmap is available online and is available in English, in French, in German, and Spanish. So thanks. This is where I end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Athena. That was really great. Thank you so much. I will directly hand over to Cheryl. Cheryl, if you could start your webcam and unmute your microphone.
Thanks very much, Lillian. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you, but we can't see you.
Okay,
yes,
hopefully you can see me. Great.
Yes, that's great.
Well, I think, Athena, you finished on a good point for me to take over, global movement for transformation, and that fits in very well with where I wanted to start. The first slide, I was just, maybe we're all speaking to the converted here, developing to destruction. I mean, perhaps as we consider the word development that we've been using as a response term to those who are in need to improve their level of living, we might need to change that term to restorative development, or think through our models of development, because they have been taking us down a road towards using different styles that are causing destruction. So it's just a thought there, but we know what we're up against. And this slide just tries to show you all the issues. And the recent IPPC report that came out this last week, I think, captured the seriousness of what we're dealing with. And I won't go through that, but the full report can be read for those who are interested on that link. So what I wanted to focus on, though, in my session was the challenge. And I think the biggest challenge that we're up against can be summarized in these 4 points: ignorance, neglect, arrogance, and greed. And then the question is, well, how do you deal with those 4 massive challenges? Of course, with ignorance, you can inform and raise awareness. And then the question is, in what way would we raise awareness and inform people? And I would, and you'll see on my last slide, I would suggest that the information and awareness raising has to start almost at preschool and before for the children of the next generation. We need to win them in all the way through their school. And so I would suggest that inviting educational curriculum devisers to consider embedding this into the core curricula of children all the way through primary, secondary and tertiary education will be key, as well as then raising awareness with the general public and thinking about how to do that. I was just thinking back over the years when seat belts were first introduced as law in the UK and maybe in your countries as well, and there was outrage about this imposition that the government was imposing on the freedom of the population. And they're saying, if we want to wear seat belts, we want to choose. We don't want it to be law. And there was a huge, big struggle, and there were protests, and there was a lot of backlash. But if you think about it today, it's now common sense that seat belts were needed. And so if you think about that change process and the raising awareness that went on to bring people to a point of using seat belts, then I think we have to think about how do we raise awareness through through our public, through the everyday person on the street, to come to the point where they are realizing a significant change in how they are living their lives needs to take place, and that a concerted effort is needed by all if we are to make a difference and to reverse the dangers that we are aware are happening. So this motivation is the key word that we need to think about. We can have the passive motivation, or we can have a penalty-driven motivation, which I think is where discussions at policy level needs to be held at, because sometimes penalty-driven is the only way to bring about resisting change in communities. And I can go a little bit more into what I mean by that on the last slide. But to never underestimate the power of people movement. If I think about the fact that we're seeing in our supermarkets more and more people refusing plastic bags and demanding of the providers, the supermarkets, that they now start removing plastic from their products. Those suppliers will have to concede and adapt, because they want the clients to continue to purchase from them. So this motivation and getting people behind change is another key way of bringing about change, especially when it comes to the issue of economic-driven change. And then, of course, what are the laws that we think are needed to be brought into place? And that might then need to be backed up with penalty-driven. So there are some things that it would be great to talk about in addressing the ignorance, neglect, and the arrogance and the greed that may need to require the full level of informed to law change. Just a moment, I know Dietrich's already spoken about the theological aspect of ecology, but I just want to maybe just focus on the church for a moment here. Because I do think that partly why the church is not engaging or is being silent at certain places in this is a poor theology. And it comes back to their worldview. What is driving? How do they see it? I was at a conference of 3,000 young students, university students in Kenya a year ago. And simply just speaking to the students and taking the theology but making it street accessible, in that saying, well, if God is creator of all things and he is therefore the owner of all things, who owns the street? Who owns this lake? Who owns that tree? And if we as followers of Christ are therefore the stewards of his creation and are to care for it, what is our responsibility when he is the owner? And to start trying to change perception and to take theology into, well, what does that mean for how I actually care for the things that I'm growing, or for the street that I'm living on, or for the trees that are around me? So I think it's not only having theology, but it's making it accessible into everyday life. What does that mean if indeed we are stewards? Of course, if you also look at the theology of escapism, where people in the church would say, perhaps as God is going to destroy this world and create another one in the heavenlies somewhere else, why care for it now? And again, it comes down to, again, worldview. What is God going to do with this world? How is he going to transform it? It seems to me in Revelation that he's going to come down and restore it rather than creating us a new planet somewhere else. What does that mean? What does that look like for everyday care? So it's rethinking our theology into a much more, and dealing with the bad theology that's already out there that I think we need to address in the churches. And that's going to require a significant amount of training at denominational levels, training at each local church level, training at Bible colleges, and embedding good conversation around good theology. And again, I think we come back to what Micah exists to try and address, is this dichotomy between, isn't it about just saving souls, evangelism as priority, or to recognize the restoration of the whole planet that God wants to redeem? And I think Dietrich captured that well. So how do we challenge this lifestyle change, and how do we deal with the engagement opportunities for the church? Maybe the next slide that I wanted to just have a look at. Recognizing that all the time, the people who are being most affected immediately, although I think we will all be affected, the people that are being most affected by the climate change that we're experiencing are those who often have the lowest capacity to respond, the vulnerable who are dealing with the rising waters, etc. So I think education for me becomes a key in this whole change process, and helping people to become more climate literate and understanding how that works. So those who are skilled in social learning, we need to sit and think, how can we do this more effectively in the various contexts, recognizing that each culture may have slightly different ways of promoting that learning. Capacity building to make good policy. How do we influence and disciple our nations on that? I know that many nations are attending the COP meetings, but they're struggling to implement and to keep to the deadlines and commitments that they are. How do we help them to do that? What are the essentials that need to be protected with great urgency? How do we corporately and together ensure that protection and that restoration process is in place? And then those that are recognizing that we need then to manage the systems that we have with renewable resources. And I think, Athena, you covered that well. Very high on that is the integration of freshwater management. And I think Ben will be talking a bit about the Renew Our World initiative that addresses the carbon emissions reduction and pollution, etc. But I think the issue is, and that's where we need to have the political willpower to sit in dialogue about it, is that there will need to be a level of compromise. And this is where greed and business and economy kicks in, where each country is trying to increase its outputs, and we're trying to say there's going to be a level of required trade-offs in order to meet the changes that will reduce the impact that we're having on climate. So what could that look like? Well, of course, there needs to be a far greater concerted effort. There's one thing that comes clearly to me, and why we need networks like Micah and others, the alliances, the WCC, the WEA, Lausanne movement. We need to recognize that we are not in competition, but we need to put all our effort to recognize how to lobby effectively, how to lobby together, how to be a greater voice to bring about the changes. Now, at a donor level, I would say that donors who are giving grants for all sorts of development work, relief work, any kind of restorative work, or even business economic trade work, they need to be prompted to embed into each of their grants a requirement for those who will be delivering that project to have clear, ecologically friendly and environmentally concerned approaches. Businesses, there needs to be a sustainable, auditable response that businesses need to prove that their production is increasingly eco-friendly. Civil society, all public figures need to require to express what their stance on environmental care is and towards what they're doing. Micah was piloting in Switzerland this idea of having a sustainable organization audit, so all the Christian aid organizations and mission organizations could do ecological audits to prove that they are in every way practicing good sustainable aid. And I think that needs to be promoted into a more certifiable step. Training institutions, the same. Many training institutions need to be checked to see how they are delivering that ecologically friendly. Of course, the green churches and Arosha have been doing great work in enabling churches to become more green. Networks and alliances, the same. All their partners, they could be promoting and ensuring that all members, a required element of membership is to produce a eco-friendly statement of improvement on what they're planning to do throughout the next 1 or 2 years. And then we can work down, and I know that Ed and Ben will be looking at churches and families and individuals in lifestyle changes. But just maybe to comment a little bit more on this with those change processes. I know that many of those Christian organizations and others that have been listed here have affirmed and confirmed that they're committed to eco-friendly approaches. However, when I travel to their projects and I travel to see how events are being run, or when I travel and see different aid projects being delivered, and or go into the homes of the aid workers themselves, I do not usually see a lifestyle change. So there is a business mentality that it needs to happen, but there is not yet a heart change that is affecting. So what I would want to see is the biggest issue that we need to bring up here is a consistency, so that from the CEO throughout all the staff and partners, etc., a commitment that everything must change from their home life to the way they deliver the project. Now, what does that mean? It might mean that we have to create suggestions or strong affirmations that we will only limit our travel to X number of travels per year, or we will do change the way we deliver certain types of aid. But it requires a level of networking, a level of concerted effort to achieve those changes. And that's what I think we need to sit down and talk and bring together all the different organizations and their different levels of commitment, from government policy level lobbying to individual lifestyle change, and to say, now, how do we disseminate agreed steps in order to bring about those change? And finally, I couldn't help myself but to say, well, what does that mean for the church? And I hope I'm not standing on toes here, but the church is the pulpit should be the point of justice for our environment and for the whole of creation. It should be speaking out on behalf of good agriculture. It should be speaking out of good practice and eco-friendly activities. It should be the very center of equipping believers on how to respond to creation care. And it should be facilitating the dialogue in every community where a local church exists. It should be creating the spaces for each of the neighbors to consider how can they, corporately and individually, become more green. And that, I think, is the key change that we're needing to address. How do our churches become those pulpits of justice for creation care? And that's going to be a theological and practice push. So I'll end there and look forward to hearing what Ben and Ed have to say to build on that argument. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. That was great. I will hand over to Ben now. Ben, can you unmute your microphone and start your webcam?
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you, but can you also start your webcam?
Yeah, and can you see me?
No. You have to click on start sharing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's
okay,
right.
We've started sharing. Excellent. Great. So I wanted to start by thinking about the politics of how is this global transition going to happen, who's in the way, and who's on side. And this is the vision I had when I came 15 years ago nearly to start working for Tier Fund. Was I could see huge potential to bring the church to the party, and particularly the evangelical church, that other people cared about justice, saw that climate change was part of that, and were taking action and speaking up, and the church could, but mostly wasn't. And back then it was true, and perhaps now it's even truer. The church has come to the party quite a lot. So the Pope certainly has. The Anglicans have, although I don't think everyone's noticed. The Orthodox Church, as we heard earlier, have had a huge influence. But I think there's a missing space for the evangelicals, really. Certainly at the level of recognisable, famous faces globally. Which evangelical leaders are standing up, giving the kind of lead that we've heard from the Pope? And it's hard to think of that kind of national status leader who has done it, who can personify something that the secular media will understand. Although I have hopes that in the UK, Nicky Gumbel will be that person shortly. So how do we bring the church to the party, especially the evangelicals? Next slide, please, or do I move them? Thanks. Yeah, so politically, there's a confluence where there are big and influential evangelical churches and where there are big, powerful countries that are blocking action, and that's particularly in the US, of course, and Brazil. Australia, where the evangelical church is less influential but still worth motivating, and that's particularly because the evangelicals are much more likely to be able to reach people who are on the right or the centre-right politically, and that's a very, very strategically useful thing, because those are the people that other parts of the environment movement or the development movement find it hardest to reach, but we can. The Catholics often can too, in many contexts. But there's a particular job, apart from just wanting to motivate the evangelical church, because that's my home. I can see that politically there's a particularly useful job to do there, and there aren't that many people who can do it. So that feels like our calling in my part of the church. How do we get that to happen? And at the moment, you can see in the US and Brazil particularly, and Australia, you can see we are not yet making that happen. And you can see how urgent the need is, even more than when it was George W. Bush refusing to commit the US to climate action. Okay, next slide, please. So part of how we work out that dream of bringing the evangelical church to the party is the Renew Our World campaign, which the World Evangelical Alliance and Micah and the Anglican Alliance and many others on this call are part of. So the idea is that you can lead a national Renew Our World campaign in any country in the world, north, south, big emitter, small emitter, big church, small church. So we've got 13 countries at the moment, covering most continents, but not currently Antarctica, which is okay, or North America, which is the one I'm eager to fill next. And I don't know if it'll be Canada or the US first, but I'm optimistic we'll soon have campaigns in both. Next slide, please. So the aim of the Renew Our World campaign is to speak up on climate and other aspects of justice as well, economic as well as environmental, but climate change is top of our agenda at the moment. And to encourage the church to make lifestyle changes, and to, partly for their own sake, but partly to change norms in society beyond us, and also to use as a political signal to show to decision makers that we're putting our money where our mouths are, as well as speaking up. To do that speaking up, to help equip people to organise their churches and do grassroots organising beyond that, and then to link that into policy change. So this picture is from the climate strikes. There were two waves of climate strikes last week, and this is from Malawi, where they joined in the second one last Friday. So they had a march and also a litter pick, and that was particularly a plastic litter pick, and that was because a recent victory for Renew Our World in Malawi was winning a High Court battle to uphold a government ban on plastics. So Malawi banned plastics. The plastic bag manufacturers took that to court. It went to and fro. We helped hire a lawyer to augment the government lawyer, and they won the case. So now Malawi has banned plastic bags, and we helped make that happen by working with other people as well. Okay, next slide. So what I wanted to talk about was how do you motivate evangelicals to act? And part of that is theological, and part of that is not. It's maybe sociological. So this is a mixture of reading I've done, seminars I've been to, research other people have done, and my own experience. So it's perhaps UK-centric, but it is bigger than that. So I'm thinking, practically, how do you motivate evangelicals to act? So to change the way they think and feel enough to change what they do. So part of that is people like Tim Keller here on the left. It's internationally famous thought leaders from the church. Part of it is their own local church leader. That is important. Part of it is the media they consume. And again, the this constituency is more likely to choose media like the Daily Mail in the UK that are sceptical about climate action and maybe not keen to think about justice, or certainly not keen to think about it in a systemic way if they do. And finally, friends and family. So all of those influences are very important on the people we are trying to reach. Some of those we can't control, and some of them are outside the church as well as in it, which is all obvious, but it is well worth reminding ourselves about this. This is why we are strategically useful, and this is also why our task can sometimes be hard. Next slide, please. So how do you motivate evangelicals to act? Not always with the standard activist tactics that the broader climate movement tends to use, such as marches like this damp one in Edinburgh just before the Paris Agreement. So there's been some very good research by Climate Outreach, who I really recommend, finding that words that motivate activists and the kind of people who tend to produce climate communications are often off-putting for people who are conservative in their mindset and perhaps also in their politics, but conservative with a small c is how they put it. So the idea of justice motivates people like me very profoundly, but it may mean something very different to people I'm trying to reach, and the word fairness is often a better word to use. The idea of change. So again, for people like me, the idea of change is stimulating and motivating. But don't forget, to many people it's threatening. So there was a slogan recently, to change everything, we need everyone. And neither of those things will appeal to large numbers of people who are in our churches, whose mindsets we want to change. And also the idea of the environment. So partly these are people who do not identify as environmentalists, which doesn't mean they don't care about the environment, but it means they think environmentalists are not people like them. And it also means that the environment does not sound urgent. It sounds like something important that's always there, that you can rely on, something to do later that doesn't necessarily have to be today. It's very interesting research, and it's really helped me, and it chimes with my experience talking to people. And I particularly wanted to mention the story of Bob Inglis, which you probably know already. So he was a Republican congressman. He said he knew that people who talked about the environment they were in the other tribe. So he remembers saying that Al Gore talked about climate change, so he knew it must be a lie because Al Gore talked about it, because everything Al Gore said must be wrong. And it wasn't until he heard from his own son that climate change was real and was important that he changed his mind and set up the Republican organization that he works with now. And it's a powerful reminder that which tribe we are seen to belong to can stop people hearing anything else that we say. Next slide, please. So how do you motivate people, evangelicals, to act? So faith is a very powerful motivator if you can reach the point where they will start listening to you. And again, my experience and the research I've seen is that you need to relate that back to the basics of Christianity. If it looks like something extra, like something being added on, that is off-putting. But if you go back to how do we love God in our times, how do we love our neighbours, it is very hard to argue against those things, and they genuinely do motivate people. And people do intrinsically understand the value of creation, and framing it as creation instead of nature or the environment is very powerful. And if you start with people's own experience of where do they feel closest to God, that's often a good way to connect them, that bypasses all the things about who's an environmentalist and what kind of people do I see pictures of in rallies that put me off. And when you do motivate a Christian, that hope, that spiritual power, often makes them stay much more motivated for longer in the face of more disappointments than secular activists who I've worked with, and you might recognize that yourself. And two other things that motivate the church are when we feel we are taking our place in society, that there's a place in the public square that we sometimes don't occupy, but on climate we are. That motivates people. And similarly, that young people are sometimes not interested in church, but when we talk about this, we bring some of those people back, or we at least start the conversation with them. That motivates people in church, and it's particularly likely to motivate the pastor. Okay, next slide. But don't forget the practicalities. So motivating evangelicals to act, the big picture is very important. Who you are is very important. Having messengers they trust is very important. But also just the bread and butter, repeating things and making it simple and convincing people that the particular action you're asking them to take really is useful, and illustrating that in ways they understand. So, for example, I often ask people to do these 4 things in their lifestyle and say these are the most useful ones, at least in a wealthier country: fly less, drive less, switch to renewable energy, and eat less meat. And before we created an easy mechanism for people to switch their electricity, most people didn't do it. They didn't know how, it sounded complicated, they didn't quite understand what difference it made. When we created something called the Big Church Switch, it was still surprisingly hard to get them to do something that really is quite easy, because it sounded difficult. But creating a scheme that people could do it through did hugely increase the numbers doing it, even if the numbers were still much smaller than I wanted them to be. And don't be surprised when people find instructions that seem simple but are sacrificial to be off-putting. So just because we're Christians doesn't mean we love sacrifice more than anyone else does. So calling people to eat less meat who love meat, or where it's a big part of their culture, is quite hard going. Doesn't mean we don't need to ask, it means we need to keep saying it and show that we care about the people who produce the meat now. And similarly, I did an experiment where I went to churches and said, fly less, drive less, switch to renewable energy, and eat less meat. These are the most important things you can do. And they listened, and people looked sad about it, but they took it on board. But when I omitted the fly less one, people looked much happier. And it made the task less easy, because I'd left out one of the hardest things. And that was an interesting experiment. Okay, next slide, please. So I wanted to end with a little challenge to me in particular, but to all of us. Why aren't we being more prophetic? Why is the most prophetic voice on climate in the world a secular one? It's Greta, and I love this picture of her. But when Jesus began his ministry by preaching a sermon that was so provocative he was nearly thrown off a cliff, he went, and that was his first one. He didn't warm up to it. That's how he began. Why aren't we the most prophetic voice in the room? And I won't try and answer that, because I don't like the answer. I'll pass it on to the next speaker. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was nice. I will hand over to Matthias, who's sitting right next to me.
Yes, thanks so much, Lillian, and thanks so much, Ben. This was very inspirational. And I especially love the idea of bringing the church to the party, and that links to my little contribution to our webinar. Because I reflected on our title again, how Christians can really engage in creation care, and reflected on the idea of individual versus collective. And basically what I thought was it really links well to our vision as a World Evangelical Alliance Sustainability Center. So I have brought you our vision page, and I basically want to say a few points to the 4C. The church is championing creation care. This is really part of our vision where we say, yes, there is space and necessity for us individual believers to engage in creation care. But what is truly transformational, what will truly bring about change, although change is a bad word, I just learned, is being together and being unified. And this is the church. So we really truly believe in the church as being the transformative force in this world, although we need definitely more individual followers of Christ playing a leading role in global sustainability efforts. So we need to be that prophetic voice, as you put it, Ben, that is in the room and that really is listened to. But the other points really are collective, are really having to do with our unity as the body of Christ and as churches and congregations. So why the church? Why churches? It's interesting again to look at the term that Jesus actually uses in Matthew 16 verses 17 to 18 when he talked about the church, ecclesia, because just a little reflection on that. What does ecclesia actually come from? Where does it come from? The Greeks used this term for political gatherings of all citizens of a city that had the right to speak. So all of these citizens gathered, and the ecclesia actually handled issues of coexistence. They were discussed there, they were decided, and the ecclesia took political responsibility for the whole community. And let us just reflect on that for a moment. Is our church truly in that state that it lives up to this word ecclesia? That is the question of today, and that is probably the challenge of each new week and each new Sunday. Why does our 4C say churches championing creation care? Obviously, you can think of a champion of somebody who is mastering something or is always winning in something. But it's not always only about being the best. A champion really stands up for something or somebody. So that is something that is really important to have in mind when we talk about the term champion. A champion is a defender, not only of its own success, in the sense of not being a one-hit wonder, not just striking once and winning, but over and over again, time and time again, delivering great and delivering a good performance. A champion is also a defender in the sense of an apologist or an advocate. And I've brought you these two terms. So we stand up for a certain belief or conviction. We ensure continuous support. In that sense, we could also be a champion in the sense of a maintainer. Nearly up to that point of being a protectionist, especially in institutions driven by theology. It's sometimes really important to defend weak topics and challenge the strong ones. And a protectionist in that knight-like attitude and with knight-like values is really defending the weak, taking from the strong or challenging the strong. And as we talk about environmental conservation, as we talk about creation care, I sometimes have the impression that we need to be a little bit more champion in that direction. So how Christians can really engage in creation care has a lot to do with the church, with the collective. And I put together 4 E's where I see that we can really take the next step as a church. Or how can you sort of get into the activity of being engaged in creation care? I think first of all, we've heard that multiple times in this webinar. It's a matter of exploring. It's a matter of studying, of preaching, of diving deep into some topics. What does it really mean that the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it? What does it really mean that God has sent his Son because he so loved the world? And the word that is used is the cosmos. So it doesn't only include human beings, but it includes all of creation. So if we come to an understanding of the ecclesia that is really taking responsibility, that is discussing issues of coexistence, what does it mean for us? What does it mean for us to be a follower of Jesus in the year 2019, when we have a lot of victims of climate change around the world? We can maybe diverge in our opinions what the root causes of climate change are. That may be a valid point sometimes, although well, okay, let's leave it for that. But what we cannot discuss is that there are horrible effects on thousands and millions of people worldwide. Cheryl had it in her presentation, especially the weak ones. And we cannot be silent about that. What does it mean for us as followers of Jesus to ask ourselves, who is my neighbor in this year 2019 in the age of climate change? The next word is engage. If we have explored, if we have studied, if we have preached about it, let's engage in discussions, in campaigns, in events, in happenings. And Renewable World is an excellent platform for that. Ben has already talked about it. As we move on, we start to enable action. And this is very important from my point of view, because it means to create a conducive environment for environmental action. To act individually is important, and if an institution acts itself, it's wonderful. But if the institution acts as an enabler of change, and it creates a conducive environment for its constituents and other people who may be inspired about it, that is powerful, and that is real transformation. And then the next stage is to encourage others to do the same. That is the stage of being a light to the world. So what about shining our light in this year 2019? What about our saltiness, our light function that we have for the world? There's a nice sentence that says, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I often ask myself, does this world, does international politics, does the UN level know how much we care? And the message really is, we need to let them know. And that is one function that also we as the WEA Sustainability Center play, that we carry examples and good practices from the local level up to the UN level. We had wonderful experiences this year where we could speak to environment ministers at the United Nations Environment Assembly in Nairobi. And we heard that before. We need to raise our voice. We need to actively build alliances. All of this was already part of this webinar. And this is just my 2 cents, the 4 C's and the 4 E's. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Matthias. Great input. I will hand over to Ed now, who is presenting to us the last input of today. Ed, if you could enable your microphone and your video. Yes?
Can you see me?
We can see you.
And
yes.
You can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah, it's not very loud. I don't know if you can change something about that.
I don't know how to change. I can speak up.
Yeah.
Is that better? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank you for having an American on here. I have heard my country mentioned several times, and perhaps all that is reason for you to pray for us. I can assure you that that there are a few Americans who do care about this issue, and we do need your prayers. I used to go to many other countries and say, we have a president we'd like to share with you if you'd like one. But now we're in competition because the UK has someone they'd like to share too. So anyway, I realize that we're coming to the end of time here. I feel like sharing the verse that the missionary once shared, who was the last speaker at a missionary conference, when there was no time left, and she said, I only have time for one verse, and that's the verse, all those who came before me are thieves and robbers. But actually, I think I can share with you in a fairly short way, in a way that will summarize almost everything that we've heard before. And the key verse is on the screen, 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, I will forgive their sin, and I will heal their land. Now, this is one of the classic verses in the Bible to talk about repentance. And one way to think about repentance, with apologies to Ben, is using the word change. So I'd like to suggest that everything that we've been talking about this morning comes down to figuring out how we can change change many aspects of how we think and how we address this issue. So could I have the next slide, please? Next slide. So what we need to do is we need to repent. And we need to repent of our environmental sins by changing how we think, how we live, how we work, and how we vote. I will just spend a couple of minutes talking about these, and then perhaps, I don't know if we have time for questions, but we need to change, first of all, how we think. And this involves how we think about God's creation, and then also how we think about the task that is ahead of us. We've had perhaps a couple of times this morning or today, have heard reference to we need to care about God's creation if we're going to do something about it. We care about things that we love. And so the first thing I think is important for us to do is to change how we think about the world outside our doors. I know that I have been in this work for perhaps 20 years or so, but I can still chart in my own mind how I changed, how I began thinking about the trees, the flowers, and the birds as I began reading about God's creation and about biblical material about it, and starting to understand that God is revealing himself through his world. He's speaking to me through his world. And I need to begin thinking about God's creation in that way, that the creation is a way that God speaks to me. It's also, creation is something that God loves himself and God cares about, and God's called me to stand alongside him in caring about it. This change in attitude toward God's creation, learning how to love it, I think is fundamental to everything that follows. It also suggests for those of us who are parents, or as church leaders, if we're thinking about parents and families, that this is a particular area of responsibility for us. We need to change our children's attitude towards creation, and that means raising them outdoors as much as possible. It means exposing them to nature. It means getting them outside and teaching them from the first time they can walk that God's creation is something they need to learn how to love. And this is a challenge today with the screens all around us, but I think it's vitally important. There's another aspect of thinking too, though, and that's we need to change how we think about the task ahead of us. It's very, very easy to get discouraged and think the task is so big and I'm only one little person. What difference can it possibly make? When for me to turn off one light bulb, or for me to drive 10 less miles, or for me to make one less airplane trip. And this is where we have to realize, I believe, that the law of large numbers kicks in. Our creation problem, our environmental problem, has been caused primarily by billions of us living lives carelessly. And the way to reverse it is for millions and billions of us to change how we live and to no longer live carelessly. So, for example, I don't have the exact numbers. It's a long time since I've read this particular statistic. But over a period of about 20 years, while the U.S. was increasing its population by more than 50%, its use of water for domestic purposes, that is in houses, for bathing, for toilets, for laundry, and so on, went down by 50%. How did that happen? Population goes up by 50%, but use of water goes down by 50%. What happened was cities and towns and states across the country began requiring the use of low-flow shower heads. Shower heads that produce a decent stream for having a shower, but use about a third or a quarter or less of the amount of water that the old ones did. The result was millions of people using less water for showers, and the overall water consumption went down even though the population went up. It's the law of large numbers. many people doing small changes make big impacts. So we need to change how we think. Then, of course, we need to change how we live, and I would mostly point this back to what the previous speakers have said in several different ways. It does matter what we do in our houses. If we can't stop at thinking, we've got to start taking the thinking and putting it into action. We need to change the amount of energy that we use. We need to change the kind of food that we buy, the kind of food that we eat. Certainly meat is a big one now. I would say beyond even meat, in the U.S. anyway, changing where we buy our food. If we can go to farmers markets and buy directly from the producers, then often you can buy meat and eat meat, but it's meat that's been raised sustainably. Or even if you buy your vegetables from them, you're putting money directly into the hands of the producers, and you're probably buying vegetables and fruit and so on that is much healthier because it's organic, and it's gone through far fewer hands from the field to your table. One of the things about how we live I think is important for us as leaders, and that's not to create a list of requirements that I will not go to a group of people and say, you must drive a certain kind of car, because I don't know what their circumstances are. In some places, it's very easy to live without a car at all. In other places, such as the northern U.S. or Canada, you may well have to have an SUV of some kind with four-wheel drive because of the amount of snow you get. So rather than telling people these are the 10 commandments of how to live, I think the idea is to tell people you need to look at how you live in light of how you've learned how to think, and ask God to guide you in the individual decisions that you make. Thirdly, and this is vitally important, and I seldom hear people mention this, we need to change how we work. And a very quick hypothetical example of this. I could take my energy use in my house down to 0, or I could stop traveling altogether, and that would have a certain amount of impact. But if I happen to be the facilities manager at the shopping center about a mile away from my house, and if I can find a way for that shopping center to save 10% on its electricity bill, I will not only have done wonders for my own boss in terms of his budget, but I will have saved multiples of energy over what I could save in my own home. Every single one of us who has a job has an opportunity to have an influence far greater than we can have in our own homes. Whether that job is in a shopping center, whether it's in a company where I'm responsible for travel perhaps, or for vehicle policy, whether I'm a teacher and have influence over how children are going to think about this, and in this context, perhaps whether I'm a Sunday school teacher or a pastor, the people that I can, that will listen to me. That's how we work is vitally important. And then finally, and this doesn't really need expanding on, how we vote. Just one quick example. I was concerned a few minutes ago because there was some loud construction noise outside my house, and I was afraid it was going to interrupt my sharing with you. The construction noise is because we have a flood mitigation project going on. Just down the hill, I can see out my window where they have been working. The flood mitigation project is because we had a climate change related flood last August, where we had something like 20 inches of rain in about an 8-hour period. Half the houses in my neighborhood were flooded. So the city is spending millions of dollars to fix the storm drain. So when that storm comes again, and it will, the houses won't be affected. I attended a city meeting about this, and as one of the final comments, I said, you know, this is all good to try and stop these floods, to prepare for the future floods, but this is going to keep happening until we change how we vote. Until we vote in people who will be concerned about these issues and make a difference. Because in many ways, with everything going on, though we change how we think, live, and work, there are some things that only governments can do. And so how we vote is vitally important. Well, that was very quick. I hope it was understandable, and I thank you for the opportunity to share with you.
Thank you, Ed. That's great. Thank you so much. So now I want to thank all the speakers so much for their input. I think it was excellent, each input. And if there are questions, then I would like to invite everyone to either write the question in the chat window so that everyone can see, or to enable your microphone and raise your hand so that I can enable your microphone as well so that we can hear you. So we'll wait a little bit if there are any questions. And if there are questions for Dietrich or Matthias, then you can write them in the chat window and I can forward them. Okay. I was told to speak a little louder. I hope you heard me. If you have questions, please write them in the chat window or raise your hand. But I cannot see any raised hands or anyone typing. Okay. Well then, if there are no questions, and we are already 6 minutes late, then I would like to thank you all for your attention, for joining us today in our webinar. I think it was very inspiring. I thank all the speakers so much for taking time and sharing with us their inputs. And like I said in the beginning, we have recorded this webinar and we will upload it on the website of the World Evangelical Alliance Sustainability Center, so you can also read it or watch it again. This is the website. Unless, in case you have not visited this yet, it's www.weasc.org. And you can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook to make some advertisement here. And we will have other webinars coming soon, and they will always be announced on our website, where we announce the topic and the speakers. So now I have seen Manoy raising their hand. Manoy, I will enable your microphone if you want to ask a question. Otherwise, yeah. Manoy, I enabled your microphone. We can't hear you. I think many people already also have to leave. Okay. Right, I can see what you wrote. So let's be in touch after the webinar. Right then I will just say goodbye. Thank you, everyone. I wish you a great rest of the season of creation. 4 more days to go. I hope you celebrate our beautiful creation that has been given to us, and I hope to be in touch with all of you for other activities. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.